So we've heard about the built ideas of how to green the built environment, roads across the environment in its totality. We're going to hear now from Ian Poiner, giving us a perspective on the tropical marine environment.
Thanks very much, Kerry, and also thanks very much to James Cook University and the Cairns Regional Council for the invitation to speak today. I think this is a wonderful conference and celebrating our wonderful achievements with the Tropics Report. I want to change tact a little bit here and really talk about the tropical marine environment. And doing that, I really want to do 7 things. First of all, have a look at just bring people a bit of contextual stuff around the role of oceans, services from our oceans, pressures on our oceans and the consequence for our oceans and for us, and put that in a little bit of a tropical context. And that's a bit of scene setting. We'll go through that quite quickly because I want to spend the rest of the time focused on what we're doing about it, what more is required, and then try and summarise it all. So in terms of the role of our oceans, and one of the real benefits of working in this space, you do get some very wonderful pictures of some wonderful animals. So that's one of the benefits of being in the marine scene. But in terms of the role of our oceans, I mean, the Earth's ocean and coastal ecosystems, play a crucial role in maintaining the global environmental equilibrium. Oceans and marine life support many elements that are critical for human life. Marine organisms are significant contributors to the oxygen cycle. As we sit here today, we can thank our oceans for every second breath we take in terms of their oxygen production. But oceans play a major role in influencing many of the Earth's climate and water cycles. So, we really do need to think and value this system. And healthy production and productive oceans provide essential services to human communities, supporting economic well-being and human health. Lots of things, the obvious like fish and food, shoreline protection, water quality maintenance, waste treatment, source of non-living resources for energy and trade, recreation, tourism, culture, and playing a critical role in regulating the Earth's climate, as I've already mentioned. And oceans, and in particular coastal marine waters, are fundamental to the health and well-being of many communities in the tropics, both in developing and in developed areas. We live on the planet ocean, and the oceans cover about 71% of the Earth's surface, and in the tropics it's actually 76%. So it's a very, very important area for us. They're important for many reasons, but including in what lives there. It's estimated about 25% of all species diversity exists in the oceans, of which sadly still about 91% is undescribed. But there are different patterns of biodiversity distribution when you look at the coastal and oceanic worlds. And as you see from this slide, that in the coastal worlds, the species peak around the tropics. In the more oceanic, it's a little bit in lower latitudes than the tropics. And what can be say from this peaking of those coastal species, that's one of the explanations of why coastal marine waters are fundamental to the health and well-being of many tropical communities. But when we think about the oceans, we just can't think about them locally or regionally because they're highly connected spaces. They're a place where everything's moving. We all see the water movements through waves and currents and tides. Anybody's got a boat will realise that. But they're also connected in many other ways. And this slide just shows that the travelling animals connect all our oceans. So reports from birds, fish, whales and other animals carrying small tags reveal highways and neighbourhoods of the vast Pacific. For here, bluefin tuna regularly commute between Japan and California. Leatherback turtles from Borneo and Mexico, between Borneo and Mexico. White sharks, and there's some quite spectacular examples of things. They come back to where they started. So the white sharks travel from the west coast of the US to the central Pacific and back, returning to within 50 metres of where they started. The land and the sea is also a very connected place. So here, this slide, what you're seeing is that the flow of water down rivers and into estuaries and into the ocean, they connect those two systems, and the biological productivity of particularly tropical coastal and continental shelf systems are very dependent on environmental flows from the land. But sadly, when we alter those flows or add to them, particularly things like nutrients, sediments, pesticides, we alter our oceans. Furthermore, many species are very dependent on that connectivity. So, for example, the locally important red emperor species starts its life in the coastal estuaries, and as it gets bigger, it moves offshore, leapfrogging from reef to reef until it gets into the further offshore where as adults and where it spawns. So this place, the oceans, when you think about it, you've got to think about it as not just a place you see where you stand, you've got to think about it as a place that's connected to many, many other places. So in terms of the oceans, they're also they're a major source of protein, and that's probably the area that we're all most familiar with, that seafood helps more than half the world's population meet their protein requirements. And in 2007, fish accounted for about 16% of the global population intake of animal protein. But when you delve a little more detail into those figures, you see that in the low income food deficient nations, particularly many nations in the tropics, that it's particularly important. Most of these, it's a particularly important source of proteins. And furthermore, around half the global wild marine catch is in small-scale fisheries. And so sustainable fish stocks are critical to the lives of millions of people in developing nations. And for many developing nations, rising incomes are contributing to increased demand for seafood. In others, ongoing poverty means there is a high reliance on subsistence fishing as a primary source of protein source. But there is another thing happening here, and as illustrated in this slide, that the world is replacing beef and wild-caught fish with farmed fish and aquaculture. So what you're seeing is both there was a rise and plateauing of wild fish caught, but there's a concurrent dramatic rise in aquaculture, and that will continue. It has its own issues, but that's one of the other things that we're seeing when you look at the numbers. So what are the services? What's the real value to us of our oceans and coasts and seas? And I think by the way, that's a new species of octopus discovered on Lizard Island, soon to be described. The benefits from the marine and coastal ecosystems go far beyond fish and include tourism, trade and shipping and energy production. Now, marine biomes are extremely valuable economically. The slide here has got some reasonably old numbers collected in the US, and you can argue with these numbers, but in terms of the detail, but really what this demonstrated in 1998, that about a hectare of seagrass could value around about $20,000. But more recent numbers are and it's surprisingly hard to get these numbers, but there are some good numbers from the Australian economy where in 2012 the ocean contributed about $44 billion to the Australian economy. More recent figures increased that to about $47 billion. This contribution will increase to around $100 billion by 2025 with an expansion of the current industries and development of new opportunities in renewable energy, food, particularly aquaculture, but the largest proportion of this contribution, where the growth is going to happen, is in tropical Australia. And it's much more than those direct figures if you start looking at things like the value of ports and sea transport and so forth. So our oceans, our coasts, our continental shelves are very, very valuable places for far more than just fish. But we also have to remember, when we think about the oceans, it's a place of great beauty, and that's particularly relevant to where we are today, and particularly relevant to places like the tropical world. 95%, as we've already heard this morning, of the world's coral reef systems are located in the tropics and provide a range of goods and services to tropical nations, both directly and indirectly. But one of those benefits is this aesthetic value, which then gets reflected in many things, including tourism. And the one other thing when we think about the oceans, we've got to keep in mind that we do have a lot to know. Our knowledge base when we think about our oceans is very poor. It's often quoted how we know more about the surface of the Mars than we know about the bottom of our oceans, and there's a lot of truth to that. And even in places like Australia, our knowledge base is reasonably poor. So they're complex and little explored places, which adds to the issues when you start to think about how to manage exploitation, how to benefit from exploitation. So what's the pressures and what's the consequence of those pressures? Basically what we're seeing when we look globally and we look generally is that it can be summarised in more users and more use. The map, this next map is the index is the sum of impacts of human activities on the oceans. The study synthesised 17 global data sets of anthropogenic drivers of ecological change for 20 marine ecosystems. The analysis indicates that no area is unaffected by human influence and a large fraction, about 40%, is strongly affected by multiple drivers. The high impact areas generally correspond to international shipping lanes, coastal areas and areas of resource exploitation. And if you look at that in a little detail, most of the tropical areas are impacted. So most of the tropical areas, there's a lot of use going on. It's usually multiple use. The other pressures on the system, we can't, probably the most perverse and overriding is climate change. And it's both directly and indirectly. The impact of increased anthropogenic carbon dioxide emissions is the most pervasive. These emissions are changing ocean acidity and contributing to climate change with associated effects on things like sea levels, participation patterns, the incidence of extreme weather events and potential changes to ocean circulation patterns. And under the current IPCC forecast, the future of the coral reefs is quite bleak. And even when you think about those climate change and come a little bit more locally, that you see that cyclones and crown of thorns starfish have been the major drivers of quite catastrophic declines in coral current parts of the Great Barrier Reef, particularly the southern and central areas. For example, the southern GBR, you'll see coral cover has declined around 40% between 1995 and from 40% in 1985 to less than 10% in 2010. And this is primarily driven, if you think about if any climate projections increasing cyclonic impacts, you don't have to be Einstein to know that this is going to have a consequence for us here and elsewhere. But the other issue that's really happening is the coastal development is a major issue, and projections of continued infrastructure and coastal development project an increase in impact on coastlines from a current average of about 70% between 30 degrees north and south to about 81 to 95% by 2032. And in Southeast Asia and the Indo-Pacific regions, the degradation rate is much higher at the same time as this region contains nearly 92%, for example, of coral reefs and other major habitats. And as we heard earlier in the first talk, that globally urbanised, people are moving to the coast and moving to the cities, and so that you're getting things. And Australia is a very good example of that, in that 85% of Australia's population now lives within 50 kilometres of the coast, and 2/3 reside in coastal towns and cities. So you're getting this great movement to our coast and our cities, and many of those cities are on the coastline, and I'm sure many in this room will be familiar with it. The developing ports and shipping channels in close proximity to the Great Barrier Reef has prompted a comprehensive strategic assessment of the Great Barrier Reef World Heritage Area and adjacent coastal zones. So that's another pressure and consequence. Another is overfishing, and overfishing is a major pressure, and it's not just commercial fisheries. So I like these slides. While recreational fishing removes much less sea life than commercial fishing, recreational fishers do sample marine life, especially large animals. And this slide you have in 1958, you have the picture from an excursion on Key West, Florida, of a charter boat. A family of fishers display their trophies, especially large gropers. 2007, the same vessel, same operation, the size of the fish displayed by the same charter enterprise has plummeted and the mix of species have changed. But those people, I'm sure they considered they had a very, very good day's fishing. But overfishing generally has been, while marine catch has increased rapidly from the 1950s to the 1980s, driven by a combination of rapid human population growth, subsequent rise in food demand, coupled with technological advances. that improved the precision and efficiency of fishing effort and made commercial fishing in deep offshore waters viable. So global fisheries production has increased from around 18 million tonnes in the 1950 to about 154 million tonnes in 2011. And over this period, the wild marine catch increased from about 16 to 79 million tonnes. The proportion of the catch fell, in the tropics, it increased from about 16 to 79 million tonnes, but its proportion of global catch fell from about 89 to 51%. The tropics account for a lot of this, and if you look at that slide, which is really looking at the shift through time of fishing effort, you see that there's been a dramatic shift to the south and into the tropical areas and an increasing effort. So what's the consequences of all these accumulated pressures? The consequences on our global oceans from syndromes such as overfishing, pollution, coastal development, climate change, acidification, they're causing serious deterioration of the health of ocean ecosystems. And left unabated, there's a risk of catastrophic loss of biodiversity, habitats, productivity and livelihoods. And I think this is shared in the statement by Ban Ki-moon that humans have put the oceans under risk of irreversible damage when he announced the Oceans Compact. And I think what you'll see from this slide is that there's been quite dramatic changes in the declines and increasing risks for coral reefs, for mangroves, and also for seagrass. So the data for seagrass is relatively poor. And all those habitats are the habitats that feature in the tropics, and the habitats that the livelihoods of many people in the tropics and many people in industries in the tropics rely on. So that's the consequence. So in summary, the accumulated pressures, in terms of summary, the consequences, the accumulated pressures on global oceans from syndromes such as overfishing and so forth have caused a serious deterioration in the health of our ocean ecosystems, and left unabated, there's risk of catastrophic loss. So what should our response be? And how have we responded to these issues going forward? This is a long list of current initiatives that I could find by looking through the web. And so in responding to this risk, the assessment of ocean health has reached the status of legal mandate in some nations, such as the EU and the US. In the US, for example, the US executive order has got a long number on the stewardship of the oceans, our coasts and our Great Lakes. The assessment of ocean health has recently been added through the United Nations World Ocean Assessment. It's been added to that and will be released this year. And that's been added to the regular global assessments that the UN conducts on the state of the planet, and the one we're all familiar with is the IPC reports. And there's been a variety of other more regional and more specific actions as listed on this slide, and really you can conclude that the concerns over the deterioration of the oceans has generated a range of initiatives in policy and planning. But I guess you have to ask the question, will they work? Are they working? Are they likely to work? Do we have a system able to assess ocean health at a global, regional, local scale? And that's what you're required to do in an integrated approach. Otherwise, you really will struggle in this. And I would argue that, be it in a developed or a developing place, we are struggling. So will they work? And I'd argue probably not. And probably not until we have a system able to assess ocean health. And all these initiatives, because all these initiatives are critically hampered by a lack of an agreed framework to assess ocean health globally, regionally and locally. The consequence is a paucity of data consistently collected across regions and a lack of rigorous standards allowing a robust assessment of ocean health, comparable in robustness to, say, for example, the IPCC assessment reports of global climate system. The situation is similar to the situation that Justice Potter Stewart found himself when he ruled on pornography in the film industry. In a much-quoted US Supreme Court opinion, the judge stated, "I shall not today attempt further to define the kinds of material I understand to be embraced within the shorthand description," referring to pornography, and perhaps I could never succeed in intelligibly doing so, but I know when I see it. Defining ocean health has proven just as challenging for scientists, managers and for others, and yet most scientists, managers and general citizens would feel confident they can identify a healthy ocean ecosystem when they see it. Difficulties in the capacity to define ocean health in an operational way pose a major challenge to deliver on both the assessments of the state of the ocean and the appropriate interventions that society increasingly demands. So, what's more is required? That's another new species also collected just off Cairns, so I just added to the list. Yeah. In what's required? Well, what I would argue, and some colleagues who we're just about to publish this paper, I'd argue that we require a global framework to assess ocean health that meets two major requirements. We need to identify the components and process required to operationalise the assessment and articulate an effective observational basis to deliver the data underpinning a robust assessment. Past fails to establish such a framework derive from a lack of processes linking two components, so we tend to do both in isolation rather together. The concept of an ecosystem health applies public understanding of the notion of human health to ecosystems, which is intuitively grasped by the general public and policymakers. Statutory mandates to assess ocean health require a definition of ocean health, but fail to recognise that ocean health is a metaphor referring to the perceived integrity of the structure and functioning of an ocean ecosystem that is not directly amenable to simple definition or quantification. That's part of the problem. And what I think in efforts to define ocean health typically yield subsidiary metaphors such as the condition of a system that is self-maintaining, vigorous, resilient to externally imposed pressures and able to sustain services to humans. Sounds great, but what's it actually really mean? The broader concept of ecosystem health has similar problems, as a healthy ecosystem is defined as being stable and sustainable, maintaining its organisation and autonomy over time, and its resilience to stress. These are no closer to being operational than that of healthy. Directive to assess assess ocean health against properties that are qualitative and non-operational risk being ineffective, as the robustness of the outcomes cannot be audited. If you can't measure it, I don't think you ever know how well you're going. So, drawing a parallel with the assessment of ocean health in the public health system, the assessment of ocean health must involve three key components: a limited set of syndromes or maladies of concern, the identification of a parsimonious set of robust indicators of the occurrence of such syndromes, and the identification of a set of drivers causing the syndromes. But it's got to go further than that. It needs to be underpinned by an observational system collecting in a robust and systematic way the variables required to produce the indicators and the assessment of trends. Assessment then needs to inform policy action on the drivers believed to trigger these syndromes, and the observational system has another role. It has a role of verifying whether the actions were indeed effective. So actually having a feedback loop, what's going on. What would such a system look like? Just put up this table as an indicator. A framework for a global assessment of ocean health will have the following elements and processes. The is outlined here in A. So you've got the drivers, the syndromes, the indicators and variables, and we've just looked at that comparing to what we do in human health and how we might transfer that to these other systems. And the other thing is that and just note for this, it's just indicative for the ocean health in terms of the ocean, but this is an approach we're suggesting. But as I mentioned before, it's got to be more than that. It needs also a framework for the global, needs a framework in terms of an observational system to inform those indicators. The key to success is agreement on what are the essential ocean variables, or the indicators in this, the variables that inform the indicators in this scheme. And this will be a major challenge for the scientific community, ensuring the essential ocean variables are routinely collected in a systematic way and linked to assessment and action in a way that the outcomes can be audited for effectiveness. We do have, and here's just and this is not a pie-in-the-sky dream in terms of we can do this at the moment. It's not a technological impediment in terms of measurement. The impediment is to me agreeing on what the variables are. We do have some elements under development. For example, Australia's Integrated Marine Observing System is a distributed set of equipment, data and information services covering the oceans around Australia. IMOS, as we call it, integrates from the ocean into the continental shelf, into the coastal seas, as well as across physical, chemical and biological parameters. There are also initiatives underway to assess ocean health by identifying syndromes of concerns, indicators, drivers, assessment and action, and verifying whether the actions were indeed effective, such as the IOC's work on identifying essential ocean variables, and more local initiatives such as the Gladstone Harbour Healthy Harbour Partnership focused on port issues in the southern Great Barrier Reef. There are also many sectoral examples that we can draw on, so that, for example, I would say that the relatively recent marine stewardship certification of Australia's northern prawn fishery is a very good example of what can be done when people think it's unachievable. However, the challenge is to get agreement from all stakeholders, and that's government, industry and community. This has to be underpinned science, but it's not a scientific, solely scientific activity. And what are the essential ocean variables to ensure systematic assessments at local, regional and global scales, comparable in robustness, I mentioned before, to approaches such as the IPC assessment reports. The systematic, and this needs, selecting and delivering the AVs really do require the following developments: a good model guiding the selection of the variables, ambitious technological development, adaptive management and effective communication of the assessments to communicate the outcomes of the assessment in a way that fosters hope and action rather than denial and despair. And when one reviews capability, experiences, willingness to respond, I would argue this process is best led from the tropics. So in summary, I hope that I've convinced you that oceans are important but at risk. We have a range of initiatives in policy and planning, but all of it, but there's some things that are missing because of the paucity of standardised and rigorous data collected. And I would argue that ocean health should be a focus on the development of robust global observing systems, monitoring a limited number of syndromes that concern through a simple set of robust indicators of their extent and severity and the trends in the drivers causing these syndromes. The application is to inform emerging policy and management and to provide certainty to users, so it's a licence to operate, an approach that fosters hope and action rather than denial and despair, an opportunity for the tropics. Thanks very much.